Hello, everybody. It's Andrea, and I have a lot I want to cover. So without further ado, let me swing into covering it. I'm going to start with the good news. And that good news is that Trump's approval rating is up, which is simply awesome. And I will say, I saw this coming. The information comes from Insider Advantage, and I have here the headline from the Insider Advantage site. Trump approval exceeds election victory margin in new Insider Advantage national survey. Approve 50%, disapprove 46%. It would be nice if it were higher. I mean, the economy's going gangbusters. He's made peace and conflicts all over the globe. The borders are closed. All sorts of good things are happening. But the news media has been a relentlessly negative drumbeat. And again, Americans suffer from this cognitive dissonance of knowing the media lies, but nevertheless believing what it tells them. This could just be one poll. Polls are always lagging. Having worked with Rasmussen Reports, which is a great outfit, I know that there's a lag just from the time they take the poll until they process it and get it published. But according to Matt Towery, who is the Insider Advantage spokesman, and I'm quoting here from a PJ Media article, other pollsters who also have correctly polled Trump in past elections are showing the same upward trend, Towery explained. Rasmussen Reports approval shows Trump's approval on the rise as well. Basically, it is a combination of ICE raids becoming orderly and strategic and obvious evidence that the economy is actually turning to the positive. So there's more on this, but what the late, great Scott Adams always used to say is don't get hooked on the numbers, get hooked on the trajectory. That's what you should be looking at, and the trajectory is good. Why is it good right now? Because Trump is strategic. And I want to go back to a headline from February 12th. This is Axios. It could have been any outlet. ICE surge in Minnesota is over. Borders are, Homan says. Now, I know a lot of people were very upset about the ICE surge ending because they viewed it as a retreat by the Trump camp. It showed that lawlessness won. That's not what happened. What happened is that they recalibrated their approach and went for a more low-key approach. I'm not a huge Kristi Noem fan. I think she is a bit of a showboater. She'd just look more sensible if she didn't show up in skin-tight outfits with heavy eye makeup and the flowing locks. She's a very beautiful woman, but I hate to say it, it detracts from what she's doing. I can say this, I'm a woman and I'm old and I'm white and I'm conservative, but she doesn't look businesslike, and it makes it easy to say that everything was meant to advance her political profile, especially because it seems as if her closest advisor, Corey Lewandowski, seems determined to advance her political profile. Trump understood that the optics of what was happening in Minneapolis were bad for him. You and I know that the two people who got killed basically set themselves up to being killed. I don't want to say they deserve to die, but both of them engaged in violent activity around law enforcement, good rather than following orders, hit an ICE agent with a car, which is a deadly attack, and was rightly shot. And Preddy, again, refused to follow orders, got into a violent altercation with ICE, and then it became clear he had a gun. Whatever else happened, if you become involved in a violent, unlawful altercation with law enforcement with a visible gun, bad things will happen. Trump understood that even though he and ICE and DHS were doing the right things, had the law at their backs, hadn't violated the law, he understood that the optics were bad. And Trump's a very calculating man. The most important thing right now is for Trump to win the midterms, which is why Congress needs to pass the SAVE Act. The rhinos in the Senate and the don't get me started. I actually literally become incoherent with rage when I look at the passivity of Thune and others in the Senate about passing the SAVE Act, which is very simply asking for identification. But in any event, Trump made the calculated decision that he needed to change the optics. So he did. And voila, look what happens. He took away a media weapon because Trump has always understood that the media is the enemy. While I'm on the subject of Trump, tariffs. So the decision by the Supreme Court, I happen to think the Supreme Court was wrong because the act has been used, gives the president enormous powers in times of emergency. And I recommend that you look at an essay by S. David Sultzer that we published at American Thinker on Monday, discussing how the court applied the wrong test. It applied to the test a standard, major question or whatever, I'm blanking on the name of the standard, that was meant to rein in unconstitutional agencies from taking on legislative authority. Like the EPA saying that carbon dioxide, which is necessary for life on Earth, is a pollutant because of a vague grant of power from Congress. However, the president is different. He already has huge power. He's constitutional, and the 1977 act that this was decided under granted him, the president, enormous power if in his discretion he believes that there is an economic emergency, as in a collapsing economy or economic warfare being waged against the United States. Both of those were happening. And it gives him the authority to stop all trade. A subset of that must be to constrain trade through tariffs. Anyway, that's my take on it. I agree with Mr. Sultzer. I think he's right. Read the essay. In any event, Trump was unstoppable. He already knew that there was a good chance he would lose, so he already had his ducks in the row for a new tariff. And he sent out a tweet on February 21st saying, if there's a whole bunch in it, but the key part is effective immediately, raising the 10% worldwide tariff on countries, many of which have been ripping the U.S. off for decades without retribution until I came along, to the fully allowed and legally tested 15% level. I'm all for that. Let me start by going back over some things I've written about why tariffs are good. Oh dear, I got my slides out of order. You'll have to forgive me. I did get the slides in order. Forgive me again. One of the things, the big attacks on tariffs is that they are going to create, the Smoot-Hawley Act was a tariff act, and it completely collapsed the U.S. economy and the world economy, and it made the depression infinitely worse than it would have been. But the fact is, we're not in the situation we were in then. Back in the 1920s, especially after World War I, when large parts of Europe were completely collapsed, it was the U.S. that was manufacturing everything, and other countries were buying from the U.S. They needed to be able to sell to us. They needed some parity in trade, so they had money. If we imposed tariffs on them, further depleting their economies, we broke their economies and created the disastrous slide into the worst part of the Depression. Right now, America is a debtor nation. We spend way more money on other people's products than our own. And one of the things Trump wants to do is bring some manufacturing back to the U.S., but he also wants to create more economic parity, because otherwise we're in the situation of Europe and the rest of the world in 1930 when the Smoot-Hawley tariff passed. Or as I put in that essay back then, I think that was back last year in April, Put another way, the world depends on our custom. To the foreign countries' chagrin, though, because they've put barriers between our products and their markets, Trump threatened to and then did put a barrier between their products and our market. Parity, that's all he's been asking for. And, of course, he wanted to renegotiate trade agreements, and he did that with huge success. It was always primarily a bargaining tool for him. So the other thing that I pointed out in this old essay is that the whole stock market is different than it used to be. Back in the day, there were real bubbles. Nowadays, we actually have products. Yes, there is an AI bubble, but there are real companies behind those bubbles. They're being overpriced, but they're real. This is unlike the South Sea bubble where there was nothing there, or the tulip bubble where people were going in Holland to crazy lengths on a single tulip bulb. It was pure market hysteria. Or in Florida, the Florida real estate bubble of the 1920s, where people were investing like crazy in swampland that could never be habitable. That was craziness. This is enthusiasm. What we also have nowadays are huge investors, institutional investors. So it's not mom and pop anymore. And institutional investors tend to be much more careful, and they also tend to spread the risk better than mom and pop did in the 1920s. The other thing that the 1920s had was that people could borrow up to 100% of the cost of the stocks they were buying from their broker. So when the stocks had no value, everything collapsed. Nowadays, it's much, much more carefully regulated. You can buy stocks on the margin, but the margin purchases are capped at 50% of the stock, and there are all sorts of other stringent rules to make sure nothing bad happens. So 2008 wasn't great, but it certainly wasn't a disaster. So tariffs are not the problem. There are a whole lot of other problems, but it's not tariffs. We're not going to see a repeat of the 1920s. But the last point I want to make about tariffs, and this is something that occurred to me, I used to work with a lawyer. He was my mentor. He was a good deal older than I was, and he'd been a student of Milton Friedman back at Chicago. He was brilliant. And when I was still a Democrat, we had a lot of long, heated, fun discussions. And one of them was his contention that we need to do away with all tax except for sales taxes. And they need to be high, maybe 15%, at which time I, still the good Democrat, just had spilkas. Oh my God, that's regressive. You can't do that. That's putting a much higher tax on poor people than it is on rich people, because they're all being taxed 15%, but the poor people have so much less money. And he said, no, that's not what is happening at all. First of all, you wouldn't put taxes on life essentials, baby food, baby goods, people food, medicines, for the feminists, tampons. They're things that you would not put any taxes on, so they wouldn't affect the poor people. But he said the other thing is that it's only someone who has serious problems where they spend every penny they have on purchasing goods. So they don't need, poor people don't pay tax on rent, which is a huge chunk of everybody's income, and they wouldn't be paying tax on food, which is a necessity, but they would be paying, say, 15% tax on clothes. But unless they have a spending problem, they would not be spending 100% of their income on clothes. So the likelihood of their spending 15% of their income on sales taxes is nil. So they'd be spending a substantially smaller portion of their income on the sales taxes. But meanwhile, he said rich people would also be spending only a percentage of their income on sales taxes, but rich people buy lots and lots and lots of stuff, and they buy expensive stuff. So you'd capture more money from them. What he said then, and what resonated with me and helped me become a conservative, is that there shouldn't be any people in America who are not participating in the government through funding it. There shouldn't be a situation where only the only rich people or middle class or working class pay taxes and poor people don't. They're still part of the country. what's his name again from Utah, and I'm blanking on his name because I can see him in my Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was right that you have a problem when 51% of the country only takes taxes and doesn't pay them. My point with this long tirade is that the tariffs are a sales tax. They're not, so yes, tariffs are a tax, but they are a very unique tax, and they're not a direct tax on people. So they live in a hazy land. They've always been understood since George III to be a tax. But what Trump is trying to do is rejigger the economy so that everybody pays according to what they buy, and rich people pay a heck of a lot more because they buy a heck of a lot more. It is a look into how a flat sales tax works. It used to work very well before the income tax and before the left wanted all the money to fund progressive government. Anyway, food for thought there. Next, I want to go to the meaning of Prince Andrew's detention. Now, first things, I know he wasn't arrested. He was merely taken in for questioning. And I know that ostensibly the arrest had nothing to do with his sexual escapades, but had to do with him leaking British trade secrets to Jeffrey Epstein, which is a crime that could get him locked up for the rest of his life. It was a very bad thing to do. And Prince Charles struck the right tone when he said he trusts the law to do the right thing because he recognizes that the crown lies uneasy on his head if Andrew goes down and takes the rest of the royal family with him. What struck me about the whole thing was a message I saw from Occupy Democrats. Not Occupy Democrats, sorry, from the other 98%, which is a very, very far left Facebook group. And it reprints a tweet or TikTok message or Instagram from someone named Mike Stanley. And I'll read it to you. I love a lot of things about the Brits. Like when they say instead of or cuppa instead of would you like a cup of tea? Or how they, quote unquote, arrest pedophiles regardless of social stature instead of, quote, making them president, close quote. All really cute stuff. First of all, there's not a scintilla of evidence anywhere in anything that Donald Trump engaged in illegal activities with young women, either with or without Epstein. What there is evidence of is that when the government finally went after Epstein, Trump called to say, how can I help? Congratulations. Look into Ghislaine Maxwell. Trump had kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago, and Trump was the only one from that entire set of movers and shakers to work with the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. So the whole thing that Trump is a pedophile is a gross defamation. And I do think Trump ought to start suing people in high places with deep pockets, because this is a very, very bad thing. And I believe, and I can't remember right now, that some members of the House of Representatives, when they were not on the floor of the House, made these accusations or so strongly implied them that it was too cute and it was definitely an accusation. So this is exactly the take the British government wanted. This is the, look, squirrel, look, shiny toy, look, we arrest rapists and pedophiles in the UK, even though that's not what Andrew was taken in for questioning about. What it distracts from is a story from February 11th, blood boiling, Muslim child rape grooming gangs likely trafficked countless British women and girls to their native Pakistan to serve as sex slaves, the head of the independent rape gang inquiry, Rupert Lowe, has revealed. Another message says, Mr. Rupert Lowe reports back to Parliament on the latest news for his independent inquiry into Pakistani rape gangs. He mentions survivor who was forced to have sex with 600 to 700 men. She estimated 98% were Pakistani Muslims. Many, meaning many of these young women, were trafficked overseas to Pakistan. The ringleaders of a grooming gang in the UK will not be deported, this is Libs of TikTok tweet, because Pakistan is refusing to take them back. They led a gang who raped and sexually assaulted 47 girls, some as young as 12. They're both still living in the UK, and one is working as a delivery driver. And then the last one from this collection I gathered is from 2023. UK allows Muslim migrant rapist to stay in the country because he fears persecution in his native Iran. That's why they arrested Andrew. They arrested Andrew to hide the Rotherham scandal that began in the 1980s when thousands of British girls were sexually abused and the entire British establishment looked the other way from fear of offending the Asians, which is what the British call Muslims from the Middle East and India and Pakistan and countries like that. Andrew has become the perfect squirrel for those who hate Trump and are ready to praise anything that they see as a weapon against him. So color me totally unimpressed by the Andrew detention. He's a sleazy, awful guy, but this is purely performative by the British establishment to deflect from their much greater crimes. And now, on to the American establishment, Gavin Newsom. I'm from San Francisco originally. I lived there for many years before moving to Marin County. So those are two Gavin Newsom stomping grounds. He was raised in Marin County and then lived in San Francisco where his political career started. I know a lot of rumored stuff about Gavin Newsom, but I also know a lot of the facts behind Gavin Newsom. Let's start with Gavin Newsom's statement to a mostly black audience in Atlanta about his level of intelligence.
I'm not trying to impress you. I'm just trying to impress upon you. I'm like you. I'm no better than you. I'm a 960 SAT guy. And I'm not trying to offend anyone, trying to act all there if you got 940. But literally a 960 SAT guy. I cannot, you've never seen me read a speech because I cannot read a speech. Maybe the wrong business to be in.
Did you get that? He told the audience, I'm like you. I'm no better than you. I'm a 960 SAT guy. And that was hard to get to. And he's not offending anybody who's 940. He's not waving around his credentials. And he says, I can't read, which he has said before is because he has dyslexia. Was he saying to everybody in the audience, I know you're all dyslexic, which is why you blacks are stupid? I don't know. It certainly sounded as if he were saying something like that. It was a monumental stupidity that put him right in the Joe Biden column. That's the one that got all the airplay. But I would like to direct your attention to a different Gavin Newsom statement from the same, he's on a book selling tour, so from the same appearance. And this one was his shtick about being a poor boy.
Walking home, got home early. My mom was always working, so, I'm cooking, literally lived on Stouffer's lasagna, macaroni and cheese. I got finished, 2 pots of macaroni and cheese and got bored.
Let me tell you something about Gavin Newsom, the poor boy. Gavin's dad was cronies with one of the Gettys. So in the early 90s, they funded Newsom and a Getty heir to start a wine bar and wine restaurant. It was on Union Street called Plump Jack's. I remember all this because he's a bit younger than I am, but I was living in the city then. I lived near that area. Those were my stomping grounds, so I knew this area. This is a time when the San Francisco Chronicle did a big feature on Paul Moen, Gavin Newsom, Andrew Getty, and Billy Getty posing for a Children of the Rich feature that ran in the San Francisco Chronicle December 1991. If he wasn't rich, Gavin Newsom was certainly playing in the rich people's playgrounds. But wait, there's more. Another picture that's been circulating is of Gavin Newsom looking incredibly preppy at high school. And this gets to where I know a lot about Gavin Newsom. Not specifically about him, but about the world he came from and why it is very likely that if he grew up eating mac and cheese and other unhealthy food, it was because he did have a working mother. She was a career woman for whatever reason, but mostly because he was too lazy to feed himself. And I'm not even sure I believe that he lived on mac and cheese. I think that's a fable. Anyway, Gavin Newsom went to Redwood High School. Let's see if I have a little info. Yes. So this is from a request to ChatGPT. Gavin Newsom grew up in Kentfield, a small, affluent community in Marin County, just north of San Francisco. More specifically, he spent much of his childhood in the Ross Valley area, which includes Kentfield and nearby towns like Ross and San Anselmo. He attended Redwood High School in nearby Larkspur, further tying him to that central Marin area. Marin County is made up of a lot of small towns, and each of them has a very distinct characteristic. My area was a sort of solidly upper middle class area. Marin City was set up to house blacks who flooded in from the South during World War II to work in the shipyards. It's always been a very poor area. San Rafael has very rich enclaves, and then it has a lot of Hispanic, mostly, I believe, illegal alien enclaves that are very impoverished. So it's got pockets. Fairfax is hippy-dippy. San Anselmo is affluent but a little edgy. Larkspur is, they've all got a feeling. Mill Valley is also hippy-dippy but less hippie than Fairfield. Kentfield is one of the richest areas in Marin. Kentfield is fabulously wealthy. The median income in Kentfield is $231,875 per year. So that's a typical middle household in Kentfield. The really rich people drag the average up to $355,674 per year. There is no poor household in Kentfield. There are less affluent. My mother actually lived in Kentfield. Not in a fancy house. She lived in a fancy old age home, which was a very, very lovely place. She sold her house in San Francisco and used most of the money from that house sale to buy into the old age home. And I was very glad she did because she was near me. And there were apartment houses near there. There were working mothers in those apartment houses. None of them were poor. I'm also willing to bet that Gavin Newsom didn't live in one of those apartment houses. Since I've been talking about education, so anyway, the whole thing, whatever Gavin Newsom was saying, don't believe it. Next and final topic, since I was talking about Gavin Newsom and education, is American teachers. My dad was an English teacher. He adored the English language. It was his first language was Yiddish, second language was German, third language was Hebrew, fourth language was English, which he learned serving with the RAF, a Palestine brigade of the RAF during World War II. He adored the English language. It was truly the great love of his life. He was an extraordinarily erudite man. He tried to be an insurance salesman and failed utterly. He didn't have it, and also he was enough of a communist, having grown up in a very, very poor slum of Berlin, a Jewish child in a slum of Berlin in the 1920s. He was a communist because he wasn't religious. He just couldn't sell. He couldn't make himself sell people products. He saw all sales as exploitation, but he was a fabulous English teacher. Well, when Prop 13 passed in 1978, they closed this unique English as a second language school that my dad had a gig in, and he loved. He had adults from all over the world who came to learn English for business reasons, and they were very, very hardworking. Even the ones who weren't very bright worked hard. That school got closed because, interestingly, it had been part of the South San Francisco Public School District. My dad ended up as a high school teacher at South San Francisco High School, one of the worst high schools in the country. A lot of the problem was the unions, but what my dad also said, he always came home and said, women's lib killed public education. And I'm skipping ahead a little in my slides to a post I wrote in 2006. It's in my own words, but it reflects what my dad said. So it's entitled Women's Lib Killed American Education. And the paragraphs I cut were about high achieving women like Sandra Day O'Connor, or just sort of average women who were teachers. I said these women, the creme de la creme of American female brain power, got excellent educations in all the traditional fields such as science, literature, history, etc. And then, as did Sandy Day O'Connor, they found upon graduation that their options were limited. So most of them did what my beloved next-door neighbor did. They became teachers. In other words, for generations, those women teachers who staffed American schools were highly educated, career-oriented, extremely bright people. Some became embittered, burned out, and vindictive. Some stopped teaching to raise their families, and some went on to inspire generations of young people. I experienced each type of teacher and was, of course, profoundly affected by those women who fell in the last category. Actually, I should say I only had one teacher like that, but my God, Flossie Lewis was amazing. And I skipped around for a while. And then, however, there's absolutely no doubt that the opening up of the professions, medicine, law, architecture, etc., has drained away all those women who would never have viewed teaching as a calling, but ended up teaching because they had no other choices. This means that nowadays there are many women and men out there who also end up teaching because they have no other choices. But their lack of choices doesn't result from institutional prejudice. Rather, it flows from their own inherent limitations that prevent them from pursuing higher earning, more prestigious professions. And that gets me to a tweet from someone named Cremieux, which says teachers average among the least intelligent university graduates. In a given year, the lowest scoring groups on the GRE, SAT, and ACT are usually those pursuing degrees in education. Wesley Yang picked up on that tweet. Now, I want to remind you, in 2006, I wrote Women's Lib Destroyed American Education, and I was reflecting what my father saw teaching in American public education. Wesley Yang. The public benefited from huge arbitrage during the decades when school teacher was one of the only professions into which women were permitted. All of the predecessors of the highly intelligent, career-oriented women who now serve as lawyers and corporate executives were once teachers. Their career ambitions were artificially capped and routed into the formation of the minds of the next generation. All that residual female brilliance is now fully washed out of the system, which is now populated by the lowest performers among college graduates, with exactly the results in student performance you would expect. That last point brought me back to another post I once wrote, and it was about the fact that teachers whine a lot. They're incredibly entitled. They have, unlike my dad, who worked 12 months a year, summer school, regular school, took no breaks. He also, to bring in extra money, tutored. So Daddy left home every morning at 7:30 a.m. and got home at 11 p.m., 5 days a week, 12 months a year. It was grueling. Nowadays, teachers are paid very, very well. They're usually young women, not always. They can continue working when they're married, so it's often a second income. They work about 7 months a year, 7.5 months a year. It's not grueling, but they whine and whine because they know deep inside of them that they are not worthy. So they have to keep telling you how worthy they are. But it's more than that. I think there is something they're also very vulnerable to leftism, because leftism works for whiny people. Leftism says it's not you, it's the system. It's not that you didn't do well in school, it's the system. It's not that you don't know things, it's the system. And leftism has totally infected education. But leftism has also infected education by changing how we educate. I know this because every bad thing that you see in public schools today, I was one of the guinea pigs in the San Francisco public schools. Didn't affect me too much in the liberal arts because they come naturally to me. My dad was an English teacher. Anything I wrote, no matter the subject, he sat down and went over it with me for the grammar. He never interfered with content. That was my bailiwick. I'm also a prodigious reader, which helps you improve your ear for grammar. And history is just my thing. I remember dates, I see patterns, history's easy for me. Where this profoundly affected me was math. If I'd gone to a Montessori school, I might have understood math, because Montessori teaches math the way children learn math. If you want to know how to teach your children math, look into Maria Montessori. But the San Francisco public schools had all these theories. It was essentially the beginning of Common Core, and not memorizing the multiplication tables and all the weird things. And I totally never understood any of it. I was a Dummkopf. I would have graduated at the top of my class in high school and in college, and God knows what I would have done if I had ever understood math and science. But they were not natural to me, and they were taught very poorly. So in 2014, I wrote that today's teachers, unlike teachers of yore and homeschooling parents today, have an infinitely harder time teaching, not because students are inherently worse behaved than they were 50 years ago, although they are, but because their pedagogical tools are so poor. Whole language is sneaking its way back into the classroom despite a 30-year run of failures that saw the pendulum swing way too briefly back to phonics teaching. And since we have a phonetic alphabet, the latter is the only teaching methodology that makes sense. Those countries such as China that do not have phonetic alphabets spend way more than 45 minutes per day, 5 days a week, making sure their students master whole word recognition. If you have phonetics, whole word is insane. And if you have to do whole word, you better spend 4 or 5 hours a day on it. So, the system, you have poorly trained, not very bright, emotional women stuck with a methodology that does not work. But it's also math. Math, too, is becoming increasingly impossible because Common Core has also abandoned common sense. So Common Core is the fruition of what they were experimenting on in the San Francisco public schools. And then, of course, I said English classes are now left value propaganda, and their history classes are just depressing diatribes about how evil we are. Kids don't want to learn this stuff, and no wonder. Why did I tell you this? A, because it's correct, and B, because I wanted to gloat about the fact that my dad was a seriously smart guy who saw long ago what the real trouble was. On that note, I think I'm done. So let me go, and I'm rotating through the same slides again because I'm being silly. Let me go to my closing slide, and as always say thank you so much for putting up with me and my sometimes inept attempts to deal with the technology of doing podcasts. Until next time.